The candles in Lord Ashford's ballroom burned so brightly they turned the night into something resembling noon. Alara Voss stood near the east wall, a glass of untouched champagne in her hand, watching the glittering machinery of society operate with the same detached curiosity she might give a clockwork toy. Fascinating in its way. Entirely not for her. "You must circulate," Lady Cecily murmured beside her, snapping open her ivory fan with practiced urgency. "Standing at the wall marks you as either tragic or dangerous, and neither is useful tonight." "I am neither," Alara said pleasantly. "I am employed." Lady Cecily gave her the look she reserved for statements that were technically true and entirely unhelpful, then swept away toward a cluster of feathered turbans near the refreshment table. Alara watched her go, then turned her attention back to the room. It was magnificent, she would grant it that. The Ashford ballroom stretched the length of a small village, its ceilings painted with scenes of Apollo triumphant, its floors polished to a mirror shine that reflected the dancers above and below until the whole room seemed infinite. The music was excellent. The flowers were extraordinary. The people were, almost without exception, performing versions of themselves so polished that the actual person had likely been buried somewhere around adolescence. Alara sipped her champagne and was perfectly content. She noticed the Duke of Ravenwood the way one notices weather, not because one seeks it out, but because it becomes impossible to ignore. He entered from the upper gallery stairs, and the room shifted around in the way water shifts around a stone dropped into still depths. Conversations tilted in his direction. Fans moved faster. Shoulders straightened. He was tall, dark-haired, with a kind of face that painters fought over and mothers warned daughters about, all strong angles and lazy authority, as though the world had been personally arranged for his comfort, and he found it only moderately satisfactory. He was, Alara thought clinically, extraordinarily handsome. He was also, quite clearly, accustomed to knowing it. She looked away before he reached the bottom of the stairs and resumed her study of the dancing couples, cataloging footwork errors with quiet amusement. The young Lord Hathaway had not improved since last season. Lady Dunmore's partner appeared to be operating on entirely different music from the orchestra. Alara was composing a mental letter to no one about the declining standard of the quadrille when a voice arrived at her left shoulder. "You're not dancing." She turned. The Duke of Ravenwood stood approximately 2 feet away, holding no drink, wearing no expression that could be called humble. He stated his observation the way men of his rank tended to state most things, as though naming reality was the same as commanding it. "Correct," Alara said. A pause. He seemed momentarily uncertain whether she intended to continue. She did not. "Sebastian Ashford," he said, with a slight inclination of his head that technically constituted a bow without committing fully to one. "I know who you are, Your Grace." She offered a curtsy of precisely appropriate depth, respectful, unimpressed. "Alara Voss. I am companion to Lady Cecily Hargrove this evening." Something shifted in his expression, not displeasure, exactly. More the look of a man recalculating. "Then you are free for the next set." "I am not. Lady Cecily is currently occupied with the Countess of Wiltshire and will be for some time. I've just come from that corner." He said it without apology, as though surveilling her employer's social schedule was reasonable preparation for conversation. Alara looked at him steadily. "I appreciate the reconnaissance, Your Grace. My answer remains no." The word landed in the small space between them, like something dropped from a height. Around them, the music continued, the dancers spun, the candles burned, and yet Alara was aware, with the particular sensitivity of someone who spent most of her life reading rooms, that 3 separate nearby conversations had gone quiet. The Duke's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "I am asking you to dance, Miss Voss, not to surrender a limb." "And I am declining, Your Grace." The 2 acts require very different paperwork. Someone nearby inhaled sharply. Alara kept her gaze level and her expression entirely pleasant. The Duke of Ravenwood stared at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then, with a short nod that seemed to cost him something, he stepped back and moved away into the crowd. The nearby conversations resumed, slightly higher in pitch than before. Alara returned to her champagne. She did not, she told herself, feel anything in particular about the exchange. It had been simple enough, a refusal, cleanly delivered, neatly concluded. Dukes asked women to dance at balls. Women occasionally declined. The world continued rotating on its axis. She took a measured sip and was settling comfortably back into her study of the quadrille when she heard it. Nothing but a pretty distraction. A sharp tongue and no prospects. Forget her. Lord Penwick's voice, low and amused, drifting from behind a marble pillar not 4 feet to her right. And then Sebastian Ashford's reply, quieter, clipped. I have already. Alara set her champagne glass down on the tray of a passing footman. She did it carefully, without a sound. She kept her spine straight and her chin level as she moved through the room to find Lady Cecily, explained that a headache had arrived with considerable conviction, and arranged their departure within 12 minutes. She said good night to no one of consequence. In the carriage, Lady Cecily fussed over the curtains and talked about the Countess's extraordinary brooch and whether the salmon had been properly cold. Alara looked out at the dark London streets sliding past and said all the right small words in all the right small places. She was not wounded. She refused to be wounded. She was, however, very quiet the rest of the way home. Alara was already dressed when the knock came, which was the only mercy the morning offered. She had slept poorly, not because of him. She had decided somewhere around 3 in the morning, but because the salmon at the Ashford ball genuinely had not been properly cold, and her digestion was making its grievances known. This explanation was airtight. She had committed to it fully by the time pale gray light crept under her curtains, and she rose at 6 with the particular resolve of a woman who has talked herself sensibly out of something, and intends to stay there. She made her own tea. Her single housemaid, Mrs. Potts, did not arrive until 8, and Alara had long since stopped finding independence in small domestic tasks anything other than practical. The kettle was straightforward. The morning was quiet. She had a letter to write to Lady Cecily regarding next week's schedule and a book she had been meaning to finish for a fortnight. The day stretched ahead of her in an orderly fashion, and she was grateful for every unremarkable inch of it. The knock came at 7:30. She assumed it was the coal delivery, which was late and had been late 3 weeks running. She was composing the precise wording of her complaint as she opened the door. Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Ravenwood, stood on her narrow front step. He was alone. No footman at his back, no gleaming carriage crest visible at the curb. His coat was dark and plain, well cut, because it could not be otherwise on a man of his means, but without ornament. His hat was in his hands. His expression was not the one he had worn last night. That one had been armored, assured, built for an audience. This one was something else entirely, and Alara did not immediately have a word for it, which unsettled her more than his presence. She said nothing. The door remained at its current angle, open enough to indicate she had registered him, not so wide as to suggest welcome. Miss Voss. He inclined his head. Your Grace. Her voice was entirely even. You appear to have misplaced your entourage. I left it behind intentionally. How minimalist of you. He had the grace not to smile, though something moved briefly at the corner of his mouth. I would like to speak with you, if you are willing. I cannot imagine what subject requires your personal attendance at my door at 7:30 in the morning. I behaved badly last night. The statement arrived without preamble or decoration, and it caught her sufficiently off guard that she was silent for a full 3 seconds. In her experience, men of his rank did not use those particular words in that particular order. They explained. They contextualized. They described circumstances that made behavior entirely reasonable in retrospect. They did not simply say, I behaved badly. You did, she agreed. I would like to explain if you will allow it. An explanation was not what I heard you offering to Lord Penwick. Something crossed his face, swift and uncomfortable, like a man stepping unexpectedly onto uneven ground. You heard that. The pillar was 4 feet away, Your Grace. I am not deaf. He said nothing for a moment. Behind him, a cart horse clattered past on the cobblestones, entirely indifferent to the social complexity occurring on Alara's doorstep. She watched Sebastian Ashford do something she suspected he rarely did. He absorbed a consequence without immediately redirecting it. Then you heard something I am not proud of, he said quietly. I heard something honest. She tilted her head slightly. That is almost more useful. May I come in? Absolutely not. He accepted this with a nod. Then may I have 10 minutes? Here. Like this. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had never, she suspected, requested 10 minutes of anything in his life, who had spent 30 years having the full hour simply handed over. He was not performing contrition. She had watched enough performance the previous evening to recognize its absence. 10 minutes, she said. I'll make tea. She left the door open, which was not an invitation so much as a logistical arrangement, and returned to the kitchen. When she came back to the sitting room with 2 plain cups on a plain tray, he was standing just inside the threshold, hat still in his hands, making no presumption about where to sit. She set the tray on the table and sat in the armchair nearest the window. After a brief pause, he took the chair across from it. She did not offer milk. He did not ask for it. Why did you come? She asked. Because I've been thinking since your carriage left last night, he said. And I find I cannot arrive at a satisfactory conclusion without speaking to you directly. What requires concluding? He turned the hat slowly in his hands. Every woman in that room last night wanted something from me. A title, a connection, a story to tell. I have attended 400 events exactly like it, and the arithmetic is always identical. He paused. You wanted nothing. I wanted to go home, Elara said. Which I did. Yes. The word carried more weight than it should have. You refused me without anger and without apology, and then you simply left. As though I were entirely unremarkable. I meant no cruelty by it. I know. That was somehow worse. He looked up then, directly. I said what I said to Penwick because I was embarrassed and he was watching, and I did not know what else to do with what had just happened. That is not an excuse. It is an explanation, and you are correct that they are different things. Elara regarded him over the rim of her cup. The 10 minutes had already expired. The tea was growing tepid. The letter to Lady Cecily remained unwritten on her desk. Neither of them reached for the door. He came back 4 days later with a book. It was the one she had mentioned in passing during their 10 minutes, a collection of essays on natural philosophy that had gone out of print, and was, she had remarked almost to herself, impossible to find at a reasonable price. He set it on her doorstep without announcement, his card tucked inside the front cover with nothing written on it. No message. No expectation of credit. She stood in her doorway holding it for a long moment, then brought it inside, and did not mention it to Lady Cecily. He came the following Tuesday with a question about whether she believed the Enclosure Acts had been more damaging to rural communities than the introduction of mechanical looms. It was, objectively, an absurd reason to call on someone. He seemed to know this. She answered him anyway, standing in her sitting room doorway with her arms folded, and the conversation lasted 40 minutes and moved through 3 additional subjects before either of them noticed the time. He came the Thursday after that for no reason he bothered to name. She made tea again. He stayed 2 hours. Elara was not foolish. She understood the architecture of what was happening, the slow, deliberate construction of something neither of them had agreed to build. She watched it go up beam by beam with the clear-eyed wariness of a woman who had spent her entire life understanding exactly where she stood in relation to men like Sebastian Ashford, which was nowhere that lasted, nowhere that counted, nowhere that didn't eventually require her to absorb the cost of someone else's inconvenient feelings. And yet, he listened when she spoke, not with the performative attention of a man waiting for his turn, but with the stillness of someone genuinely taking something in. He disagreed with her often and without condescension, and when she proved him wrong he said so plainly, without the elaborate face-saving maneuvers she had come to expect from educated men encountering a correction. He laughed at things that were actually funny. He was quietly, almost reluctantly, becoming someone she recognized. That was the danger, she knew, not his title. Not the impossible distance between their circumstances. The danger was that he was becoming legible to her, and she to him, and legibility in her experience was the precondition for every variety of loss. Lord Penwick arrived at Sebastian's club on a Wednesday morning in the third week and delivered his assessment over brandy with the efficiency of a man who considered himself helpful. "You are courting a woman of no name, no fortune, and no connections," Penwick said. "The Hartley alliance alone is contingent on your availability. Your seat on the Trade Commission depends on Hartley. I need not draw the rest of the diagram." Sebastian said nothing. "She is clever, and she is handsome, and in 6 months you will have forgotten her name," Penwick continued, not unkindly. "End it cleanly, before it becomes a thing that requires ending." Sebastian drank his brandy. He did not tell Penwick that he had spent the previous evening rereading an argument Alara had made about land reform, not because he was persuaded, but because the shape of her thinking was interesting to him in a way he could not fully explain and did not wish to stop examining. He said he would consider it. Lady Cecily came to Alara on a Friday, sat down with the gravity of a woman delivering a terminal diagnosis, and took both of Alara's hands in hers.
"My darling," she said.
"I have watched this with great fondness and greater worry, and I must say what I would want someone to say to me."
She paused.
"Dukes do not marry companions. They do not marry women without names or money, regardless of feeling. And men in his position are not punished for following their hearts poorly. Women in yours are." Alara said nothing. "I say this because I love you," Lady Cecily said. "Not to be cruel." "I know," Alara said. That evening she accepted the letter of employment she had been considering for 3 weeks. A family in Edinburgh, 2 children, a generous wage and a room of her own, and a life that asked nothing of her except competence, which she had in abundance. She wrote her acceptance before she could revise herself out of it, sealed it, and set it on the table by the door for morning post. The week that followed was quiet in the way that empty rooms are quiet, not peaceful, but absent. Sebastian did not call. She told herself she had not expected him to, and almost believed it. She read the natural philosophy essays. She prepared Lady Cecily's correspondence. She was, by every external measure, perfectly fine. He arrived on a Thursday morning, 9 days after her last sight of him, without a book or a question or any architecture of excuse. She opened the door, and he was simply there, hat in hand as he had been the first morning, and something in his face had shed the last of its performance. "I have been told this is unwise," he said, "by people whose judgment I generally respect." "They are not wrong," Alara said. "I know." He held her gaze steadily. "I don't want a suitable match, Alara. I have been offered suitable matches since I was 19, and they all feel like very elegant rooms with no air in them." He paused. "I want the woman who told me no. I want the arguments and the plain tea and the 10 minutes that become 2 hours. I want whatever this is done properly if you will allow it." The Edinburgh letter sat on the table behind her, sealed and ready. She thought about Lady Cecily's warning and Penwick's diagram and every reasonable thing she had ever told herself about the geography of her life and the permanent distance between her world and his. Then she thought about legibility, about being known, about the particular rarity of a person who listened with his whole attention and said I was wrong without it costing him his dignity. She opened the door wider. Not as surrender, not as hope dressed up as recklessness, as a choice made with clear eyes, entirely on her own terms.